Alright, folks, here we go. Just let me know when you can hear me so that I know for a fact we are going live. Um, so this is going to be a bit of a run through. I'm going to kind of roll through this very rapidly because it is quite a bit of material. We also did a bit of a good review the other day, so this will just kind of be once more running through. We also don't have too many people here, so we'll give that a shot. I can hear myself, so I imagine that you guys can for sure hear me. So let's kind of run through this, right? Starting to talk about the leaders, right? So the leaders of World War II, you have Benito Mussolini, pictured here in Italy. You have Emperor Hirohito is going to be the main leader in Japan. I know I keep meaning to change this, and I still haven't, sadly. This is actually Hideki Tojo in Japan. This is not Emperor Hirohito, so Hideki Tojo is one of the other big leaders, right? You have Adolf Hitler in Germany. We talked about all the conditions that lead up to the rise of the dictators in places like Italy and obviously in Germany as well. You can see the mob think and group mentality that we kind of witnessed with watching The Wave. You have Joseph Stalin right here. I realize I'm not actually seeing me, so let's put me there. I am. I'm live. Beautiful. All right, so we got Joseph Stalin. It says there's three people watching, so one of them might actually be me, though. So either way, we're going to run through Grayson. If you have any questions, then we're going to go, right? So the war starts specifically when Hitler invades Poland in 1939, right? September 1st, 1939. And we also know that the Soviet Union is going to invade Poland as well, and other Baltic countries, right? They had signed this non-aggression pact in August of 1939 before the invasion of Poland. You can see Stalin shaking hands with, I believe this is Molotov, his name is. I thought that matters. Um, but basically, they are signing their deal, their non-aggression pact. Once they have that secured up with the Soviet Union, Germany's going to invade Poland with their Blitzkrieg on September 1st in their lightning war with their tanks and their mobile forces. This is how the Soviet Union and Germany had decided that they wanted to split up these Baltic countries in Poland in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So anyway, after they get done with Poland, we know that they're going to turn towards France, right? And you're going to get the Battle of France and the subsequent taking of France by the Germans and the German army. And they are going to, after that, pound Britain from the air in the Battle of Britain with the air forces, right? So we take over France. You're going to have them push through the Ardennes forest, and you're going to get the Blitzkrieg that's going to push the Allies here, the British Expeditionary Force and some French forces back to Dunkirk, kind of right around here, where they're going to be fully evacuated to England. You're then going to get French resistance and the puppet government of Vichy France under the Nazis. So the Battle of Britain, right? The air raids had taken place that are going on in England. We know that Germany is going to relatively indiscriminately bomb in some cases, right? Some entire neighborhoods, civilians are going to be killed. It's going to try to hope to break the morale of the British. Before this invasion, right? So Winston Churchill is going to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He's going to use the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, to try to repel the German Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and their successes are going to keep Germany out of full control of Western Europe, right? You're going to see some contrails there over Big Ben, over the Parliament building. You have the little girl holding her doll underneath the rubble. You have these are some of these photos are totally staged for propaganda purposes, but you can see these guys, looking at this bombed out library essentially for books. Anyway, so as this is going on, Germany is going to decide, hey, maybe it's a good idea to backstab the Soviet Union. So they're going to ignore their non-aggression pact, and they are going to invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And this is going to mostly stem from ideological aims to kind of conquer the Western Soviet Union, to repopulate this area with Germans, right? And that is going to largely be one of the reasons why the Germans treat the Soviets so badly, and these people so badly on the way heading east. How many battles did they have on the Eastern Front, Grayson? A lot. I don't know if I can really answer that question specifically, but there are some major battles, major tank maneuvers, forces. You have the Battle of Stalingrad, obviously, which is the major turning point in the East before the Soviets are able to kind of turn back the tide of the Nazis. It's a pretty big deal. Right, the forces we talked about, but the numbers there are just staggering, right? So the Axis strategy is effectively to hopefully defeat the Soviet Union quickly and to gain control of their oil fields, right? By taking control of their oil, they could actually use those for the war effort, right? So from there, they're also going to hope to force Great Britain out of the war with the bombing that we talked about in the Blitz. And submarine warfare, and they were hoping to do this before America could fully get involved with their industrial and military strength, right? So we talked about Stalingrad being this kind of turning point, right? Turns the tide in the Eastern Front. It's going to be this large siege, 5 months at least, here that's going to take place, and thousands of people are going to be killed. So the war in Europe, right? One of the things that we're going to talk about is the United States neutrality, right? U.S. neutrality is FDR. When he wins re-election, he's kind of aiming to be isolationist and looking to not get involved in these foreign wars. So Luftwaffe, Grayson, is the German planes. It's the Air Force. Okay. So during the late 1930s, you are going to get a bit of America trying to not get involved, right? They got involved in World War I. They don't want to get involved in World War II, a lot of the people. So they're concerned about that. So they actually pass a bunch of legislation to not get involved with the war, increasingly isolationist and neutral. But ultimately, as things kind of start to get worse and worse over there, the United States is going to eventually begin to help Great Britain, and it's going to give them more supplies. Sorry. It's going to give them more supplies and old naval warships in return for some actually military bases in Bermuda and Caribbean, which are colonies essentially in these areas. So you're also going to get the Lendlease Act that's going to be signed by President Roosevelt, which is going to give the president authority to sell or lend equipment to these countries to defend themselves against the Axis powers, right? And we compare the Lend-Lease Act to FDR saying, giving basically your neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire. You don't basically ask for money for it. You're just wanting your garden hose back at the end of the day. Is what FDR is going to say, right? Comparing it to the garden hose is important. Okay, so anyway, the war in Asia, right? We talked about the Japanese threat that was going to happen over there, the imperialistic policies of Tojo and Hirohito and Japan on these Asian countries because of their need for these resources, but also the racial component as well. The imperialism is going to be in Korea, in China, and also down in Indochina, it was known at this time, which is really Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and places like that, right? We know how badly the Japanese treat these people. You have the rape of Nanking and such we talked about in World II. So, anyway, the war in Asia, right, is going to kind of come to the America's doorstep on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, which is the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? The Japanese surprise attack in Pearl Harbor when Americans cracked down and embargo oil and things like that for the Japanese. So they attack, and the United States is going to declare war on them. And when the United States declares war on Japan, well, Japan's allies declare war on the United States, Italy, and Germany, and then all of a sudden we have the sequel, right? We looked at Pearl Harbor, we looked at Battleship Row right here, which is where the Japanese would have come in and bombed the American ships. You have the Japanese Zero. These type of ships had torpedo bombs that kind of were attached. They're hard points, they're called, that they would bomb the ships. And this is the USS Arizona on fire here. So after Pearl Harbor, we know that things are going to kind of get interesting. Japan is going to also strike other airfields that the Americans own in the Pacific at Wake Island and at Guam on the same day. And then they're going to continue their offensive into Thailand and Guam and Wake Island and Hong Kong, in the days following. And then that's middle of that month, they're going to actually go into the Philippines and capture the Philippines. And they're going to kick out Douglas MacArthur, essentially. Well, Douglas MacArthur is going to actually flee, who is the general at the time, and you're going to have the Japanese force march 60 tons of American soldiers, like thousands of American soldiers, 60 to 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers force march in the Bataan Death March, where you're going to have about 21,000 of these people dead, right? From the conditions. So as far as the Japanese internment, right, once Pearl Harbor happens, we know that you're going to have this xenophobia in America towards the Japanese, right? There's going to be this false belief, really, of this fear of spies. So this belief of spies, right, and sabotage and things like that, right? So the Americans, they round up all bunch of Japanese American citizens, right, and they place them into what essentially are concentration camps, right? We kind of soften the blow by calling them internment camps, but really when it comes down to it, they are concentration camps. We are taking these people and we are putting them, concentrating them in a particular area. When you say concentration camp, it kind of has the connotations of Hitler's concentration camps, and they are definitely not the same thing, but they are still, by definition, concentration camps. So, anyway, these people are given little advance notice, and they are forced to give up more or less everything to be moved into substandard conditions. We listened to George Takei's TED Talk, which was fascinating, and then listened to the song by Fort Minor as well called Kenji. And when it comes down to it, right, the Japanese, as George Takei talks about, the 442nd and the Nisei regiments, these people are earned high number of decorations in the war, right? The Japanese, they turned around, even though we interned them. You're going to have volunteers to join the military, and they are going to be the most actually some of the most decorated fighters in the entirety of the Second World War. So this decision to intern the Japanese is going to be approved essentially by the Supreme Court of the United States in what is known as Korematsu versus the United States. They're going to uphold the government's right to act against the Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States, and this is a kind of a stain on the Americans' mark here, a mark on American, whatever you want to call it, and America is actually going to have to issue a public apology to these people after the fact, and maybe even pay financial payment to some of the survivors in reparations, right? So, all right, the Pacific Front. Sorry, I got my cat right here. He wants to be my buddy while we do this. So, anyway, we have the Pacific Front, right? The Pacific Ocean is huge, and we're going to need to be doing what's called island hopping from island, little speck to little speck to little speck until we get closer to Japan, right? This is Hawaii right here. I believe this is like Guam, right around there. Anyway, the man in charge there is Douglas MacArthur, who left the Philippines when the Japanese invaded, and he's going to pledge to come back, so he aims to, and he's going to lead the military, the army, the Marines, really, over on that side. You're going to have Admiral Chester Nimitz. Admiral Chester Nimitz is in charge of the Navy in the Pacific, right? So we use island hopping. We go from island to island to island to island to capture as many of these islands, to leapfrog closer and closer to the Philippines and the Japanese. We watched the Day by Day in the Pacific Theater over there. So anyway, the turning point. My cat's claw just got stuck in my ow. Sorry guys, give me 1 second. Anyway, so we have what's called the Battle of Midway, which is going to be the turning point. Akeem. How's it going, Akeem? Anyway, so the Battle of Midway is the turning point, right, in the Pacific Front. Once the Japanese, that was kind of the high water mark there, more or less. Before that, and you're going to have this major momentum shift at the Battle of Midway when the Japanese are going to be defeated by the Americans. So, you're going to have some American cryptographers. They decipher the code. They know when this attack is going to come, and they kind of set a trap for the Japanese. And the Japanese are going to lose 4 aircraft carriers, right? So that's a big deal. It's a major decisive victory against the Japanese. These 4 aircraft carriers are extremely important to the war effort, and they no longer have them, right? So from there, the Japanese are going to be aiming to try to kind of bombard Australia with bombers, but also control shipping lanes between Australia and America. and other allied countries, right? So they're going to try to build airstrips and have army in what's called the Solomon Islands up here. You have some major fighting going on there, and the Americans are going to kind of have to clean that out there before we start heading north to Japan as well, in addition to the extra island hopping we're doing up farther north. So we watched the European theater link as well, but we do know that most of the fighting is going, well, the start of the fighting is going to take place in North Africa, and you're going to have what's called El Alamein, right? And it's going to be this big battle, this important battle that's going to kind of stop the Germans from seizing control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, and ultimately going to stop Hitler from getting control of the oil fields, right? So El Alamein is going to prevent them from doing that, like we just said. And the North Africa was aiming to be a stepping stone into Italy to overthrow Mussolini. Eventually, they're going to go into Italy. Their allied attack is going to kind of falter there for a little bit, but eventually they're going to be able to take Rome right around the same time that we are fully invading into Normandy in France, right, with what's known as D-Day, right? So in D-Day, we have to overcome what's known as the Atlantic Wall, which is these defensive fortifications that ultimately are trying to block the invasion of Europe, right? We have to go through all of these different obstacles, which you should be familiar with at this point a little bit. You don't need to know them for the test or anything, but they're there, right? So we have D-Day on June 6, 1944. This is something that you should need to know, right? You have General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's going to be the leader of this invasion. He is going to be the supreme commander of the Allied forces. You're going to have this joint effort by the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and such. And they are going to be landing on 5 different beaches, full, invasion, amphibious invasion. It's a pretty big deal. Tons and tons of people, tons and tons of hardware landing on the beach. It's these pretty horrific conditions. More people are dying here than, a lot. It's pretty bad. 1,500 or so Americans killed, 6,600 casualties or so. They're leaving these boats to go up, into the beach where they're being fired upon by mortars and machine guns, and it's pretty much hell on earth. So we win, right? We get through. We are able to land. We land all of our resources, tanks, ships, you name it, vehicles to help the war effort, right? We also use the paratroopers that we talked about, that Band of Brothers. If you haven't seen Saving Private Ryan to see the beaches, you should. It's really, really good. So fighting in Normandy, France, right? This is kind of what it looked like. You had these hedgerows are kind of like famous for some reason, but a lot of the fighting being done in Normandy in these kind of quaint little villages, almost, if you will. So from there, the Allies have to kind of go up into Belgium and Holland, and they're going to airdrop into there and push up into Belgium and Holland, where you're going to get this major offensive with the Germans, what's called the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes Forest, which is going to be this last major offensive by the Germans trying to stop the Allies. It's going to be, the Allies are going to be able to win the day anyway, and from there, this is kind of a push to Berlin, right? So on the home front, we talked about businesses retooling from peacetime, war production, kind of, and heading into manufacturing to tanks and things like that, from car manufacturing. You're going to have rationing, right, and war bonds. We talked about all this, so hopefully you're familiar with those things, right? You need to be able to allocate the resources effectively. Women at the home front are going to be becoming increasingly, they're going to be participating more and more, right? They're looking to replace men serving in the military. You're going to get your Rosie the Riveter types, and they're going to typically be participating in non-combat roles in the military, right? We have young girls and girls. She's welding here with this sweet welding torch. I'm working on, not quite sure what that is, but you have this woman who is legitimately riveting. She is riveting onto the fuselage of what looks like some sort of plane or bomber behind her, right? You have women making the posters and all sorts of different things. You have the African Americans on the home front that are migrating to the major cities in search for jobs for the war. They're going to be looking to get recognition after the war with the Double Victory campaign, right? So winning the war in Europe, but also winning the fight against racism at home, basically, is what the Double V stands for. So we have the minority participation, right? You have the Tuskegee Airmen, right? African Americans that are going to serve with distinction in Europe. You're going to have the Nisei regiments, which I just talked about in the 442nd and George Takei's story, right? The Tuskegee Airmen, this is a really cool picture. It's colorized. It's the first class of the Tuskegee Airmen in 1941, who are going to be kind of a security detail for American movements, troop movements. right? So we also have the Navajo Code, the Navajo Code talkers, right? They're going to use their language to make codes so that the Japanese could not decipher them. They didn't really have experience with the American native languages, so they were able to use this to make the code, and the Japanese weren't able to decipher it, really. They weren't able to break it by the end of the war, which is really great, which allowed us to communicate, right? And the minorities are going to ultimately suffer some of the highest casualties, but are going to win numerous unit citations as well, and individual medals for bravery, right? We talked about the government censoring reporting of the war, trying to control the narrative, trying to increase public morale with ad campaigns, and it's going to keep Americans focused on the war effort, right? You're going to have the entertainment industry producing movies, plays, and shows that are going to kind of boost morale and patriotic support for the war effort, as well as portray the enemy in stereotypical ways, right? So now, as we get closer to the end here, we are going to have Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right? That are going to be bombed to all hell with our American huge super bombers, a super fortress called the B-29 super fortress, right? So with island hopping is going to continue to the two islands that are actually Japanese islands and getting closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, Okinawa and Iwo Jima, which is some of the harshest fighting in the Pacific that we're going to see, right? You're going to have thousands of American casualties. The Battle of Okinawa, I believe, is going to last 80-plus days before we take control of the island, right? This is some pretty harsh fighting. The Japanese soldiers are going to be more willing to commit suicide than rather to surrender, right? And that's a big deal. That's why it's so difficult, right? And this is where Okinawa is. This is where Iwo Jima is, just to give you an idea, right? We talked about the firebombing of Japanese cities. You were supposed to have read an article about it too. It's linked there if you haven't. So in comparison, right, the firebombing, this is, if you can zoom in. Whoops, that's not how I zoom in. I'm not actually in PowerPoint. Sorry, guys, I need to go back down. Right, this map kind of compares the destruction of Japanese cities to American cities to give you an idea, but the devastation was tremendous, right? We talked about the Holocaust, right? We watched the video from Band of Brothers, the final solution, right? The word genocide, right? The significance after the war and the Nuremberg trials, and such, right? So we are eventually going to get VE Day, right? As we headed back toward Berlin, we talked about the indiscriminate bombing of Germany and Dresden and all these things, very similar to the firebombing in Japan, right? So when FDR is going to die on April 12th, you're going to have VE Day on May 8th in 1945, and some of these soldiers are going to actually need to go to Japan if the war didn't end soon enough, right? They were thought, and this is the celebrations in Times Square for VE Day, right? So fast forward now, VJ Day, August 15th. Actually, this might be the end of the war celebration. Japan, Nazi surrender, so this is VE Day. So anyway, VJ Day is going to be August 15th after we drop the atomic bombs, right? The atomic bombs, there's some myths that you're supposed to read the article in class. This is a picture of Nagasaki after the drops, right? And then we had addressed the question whether or not you believe the atomic bombs were justified or not, right? So this is the list of kind of some of the main talking points and the arguments, right? Some of the justifications could be how many American lives did it ultimately save? So Grayson, lots of the Japanese cities were firebombed when it comes down to it, almost all of them. Anything that could be considered a city, so it was pretty tremendous devastation and destruction that was rained down by these firebombs, right? So that's why some of these people will say that the atomic bombs were justified, because we're gonna stop this indiscriminate firebombing, kind of ripping the Band-Aid off with the atomic bombs, essentially. It's going to end the war outright. It's going to limit more unnecessary deaths. You're not going to get an invasion, right? It's also going to assert kind of American dominance in the world, especially against the Soviets and Stalin, right? So why might it not be justified? Ultimately, you're going to have, it's completely indiscriminate, right? It's killing over 200,000 people without any... Again, it's indiscriminate, right? It just kills them, or they suffer from the fallout. We watched that video in class, kind of showing and highlighting some of what was going on for these people that were suffering from the radiation, and how if they were close to the blasts. We tackled the question whether or not it was justifiable to be killing civilians in this case when it was mixed with military targets, and the true nature of civilians in World War II, right? If you are helping the war effort at home, are you really a civilian? You might not be actually fighting, but if you're building bombs and you're building planes and tanks and ammunition that's going to the war effort that's going to be used to kill people on the war, are you really a civilian? So that's just one of those interesting moral questions and ethical questions that we tackled. So the Emperor Clause in World War II, right, is an interesting fact, right? Some people why say the bomb is not going to be justified is because Japan did actually offer a surrender. It was a conditional surrender, which the Americans were unwilling to take. The Emperor Clause was essentially that the emperor would not be subject to war crimes and would also kind of remain in status. The Americans did not want that. They wanted the unconditional surrender, and that was kind of one of the last thoughts of FDR, so Truman saw that through, and they're going to bomb, right? So they bomb, and you're eventually going to get the unconditional surrender a couple days later after the second bomb. And eventually, August 15th, 1945 is VJ Day, Victory in Japan. We watched that great video about the number of deaths, right? So that is a graph that kind of shows that you can pause and look at. If you want to watch that video again, the link is on the PowerPoint that's in Google Classroom. So on that note, we just did all of World War II in about 25 minutes. That's really impressive. So if you have any questions now's the time to ask. If not, we're going to call it a night and let you study. So I'll give it about 30 seconds.